I'm Anastasia Chatzka, a fashion designer with over 20 years of experience and a sewing educator. And I'm really excited you're here to share another sewing adventure with me today. Welcome to Sewing Anastasia, and today we are going to bias bind curves, and I'm going to be using a neckline as an example of how to bias bind a curve. We're going to be doing this two different ways. One is going to be a bias bound edge, and one is going to be a face bias bound edge. In other words, one's going to be visible on the outside, and one's going to be hidden on the inside. We're also going to be using two different types of bias binding. We're going to be using single fold, and we're going to be using double fold. If you're not already a subscriber to Sewing Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when all the new videos come out. Also, now teaching virtual sewing lessons and sewing lessons in person. So check that out at sewinganastasia.com or click on that link down below. Bias binding a neckline can be really tricky, so it's a great idea to go ahead and cut a test first. So a great way to do this is take a plate, trace it out on a piece of muslin, and cut it out. And now we have a circle and we can practice sewing our bias binding around a curve. The first sample I'm going to be creating, you're going to see the bias binding on the edge of the neckline from the outside of the garment. So for this one, I'm going to be using the double fold bias binding. You can buy this pre-made at a store or you can make your own. So double fold bias binding has one fold going in and then it's folded again. So that way you have clean edges on the front and on the back. So what we're basically going to do is sandwich our fabric in the middle here and sew it together. But there's some tips and tricks to this, so keep watching. So grab your pins and let's pin down this bias binding. First thing you need to do is open up your bias binding and fold the raw edge in 1/4 inch. So that way it's going to be finished. And now what we want to do is start pinning with the right side of the bias binding on the wrong side of the fabric. And we're doing this so that way when the bias binding ends up folding over, our final stitch is going to be on the outside. So what we're doing is just lining up the raw edge of the bias binding with the raw edge of the garment. And when we pin, just pin in and out so they're nice and easy to pull out. And our first stitch is going to be in this groove that's already here. How convenient. So just keep working your way around. Try not to pull the bias binding too much. It is cut on a bias, so that means there is movement to it. And the great thing about it being cut on the bias is that it's going to lay very nice around the curve. Now, if you just cut a strip of fabric on the straight grain and you tried to do this, it would end up all wobbly and wiggly and be pulling and not look good. But because this fabric is cut on the bias, it is going to lay and pull around the curve really nice. Now you want to make sure that you're overlapping where you started. So I'm going to come over 1/4 inch and now I can cut off the extra binding. Okay, so let's lay this flat so you can take a look. So this is the inside of my garment and I have the bias binding pinned all the way around the circle. And over here, it's really important that that first edge was folded up 1/4, and now we're overlapping that second piece on top of it. And now what we're gonna do is go over to the sewing machine and sew in that first crease that you can see on the bias binding. Today I'm gonna be using the Husqvarna Viking Designer Epic 2, but you can use any sewing machine that has a straight stitch. So make sure your machine is set up to a straight stitch, regular stitch length, regular tension, all that good stuff, and let's sew in the groove. Let's get groovy. Okay, so I have my foot lined up so that way when I start sewing, I'm going to be in that groove. Make sure you backstitch. I'm also using a contrasting thread so that way you can see it easily. And also make sure you take out your pins before you get to them. So because the fabric is curved, you want to make sure that you're keeping it straight when it enters the foot where the needle is. So sew a little and then stop and then even out your curve and make sure it's nice and straight. Curves don't have to be scary to sew, as long as you're just focusing on the first couple inches in front of you and not what the rest of the garment or the project is doing. So notice how I'm sewing a little and then I'm flattening out my fabric to make sure that there's no bumps or tucks. So now we're coming back to where we started. And to finish, make sure you backstitch and cut. At the end, when you're backstitching, make sure you come 1/4 inch into the previous line of stitches and then backstitch, so that way we have no gaps or openings and everything's nice and secure. Next, we're gonna flip our seam allowance inside the binding and we're gonna flip it to the front of the project and pin it down and then stitch it on the edge. So since this is the wrong side of our garment on the inside, we're gonna flip it to the right side. And now what we need to do is flip our binding up. So I'm gonna pay attention to this edge that's left open. So you still need to make sure that it's flipped in 1/4 inch. And now what we want to do is make sure that these two edges are folding together. Make sure your seam is in and then fold it right over. Now when we're pinning this, we wanna make sure that our fabric is a little bit past that stitch line because we don't wanna see that stitch line right here on the outside of our garment. So I would say about 1/8 inch over and then go ahead and put your pin in and push through. So now we are gonna do this all the way around our garment. Cut any threads that you have. Also, another suggestion is if you have a really big seam allowance inside here, you can totally go ahead and cut it down so that way it's not as bulky in the binding. This is a pretty wide binding and it's covering it, so I'm not so worried about that right now. But if I was using a 1/4 inch neck binding, I would definitely cut down that seam allowance inside. So we're gonna work our way all the way around the circle and make sure that we cannot see that red stitch when we are pinning. So when I was pinning all the way around, looks like I had a little bubble there where I first pinned at the overlap. So I'm just going to reline this up so that way it lays nice and flat. We're taking all the time to do these double extra stitches and pin it. So let's make sure it looks perfect. Okay, so now we can see how nice this binding is looking. It is laying around the curve really, really nice. When we stitch, we're just gonna be stitching on the very edge, also known as an edge stitch. So real close to the edge. So let's go over to the sewing machine and sew that down around the edge. So we're gonna be lining up the edge of the bias binding with the inner edge of this A foot. Make sure you backstitch. So I'm also going to be using a contrasting thread so that way you can see it. Make sure you take out your pins before you get to them. Remember, because we're working around the curve, just flatten it out as you get towards the front of the foot. Try not to stress about it being a curve and treat it as a straight line. When we get to the end, just make sure you line up and meet with your line of stitches that's already there. Give it a back stitch and cut. Look how nice our binding turned out around the circle. It looks beautiful. Imagine this beautiful neckline on all of your blouses. It would be so nice. Next, we're gonna use the single fold bias tape and we're gonna create a bias facing for the neckline. which means it's going to be invisible. So we're basically using the bias binding, but you're not going to see the binding on the outside. It's going to be turned to the inside in a way as a facing is, so that way it's invisible. So we are going to attach this single fold bias tape in the same manner we would a neck facing for a blouse. So right sides together, we're gonna stitch it around and flip it to the inside and give it an edge stitch. So this time we're starting on the right side of the garment and we're gonna go ahead and pin it down. Same thing, you wanna fold over your edge first 1/4 of an inch so it's nice and finished. And notice how we just have 2 fold lines inside of the single fold bias tape. So just work your way all the way around your piece of bias tape on your neckline. Great, now we're ready to sew in that first crease all the way around in a circle. So I have my fabric and my binding lined up and we're gonna sew in the first groove. Don't forget to backstitch. Remember, sewing on a curve, just line your fabric up straight as it's coming into the machine. So you want to make sure that your stitches are in this fold. So if you can get your stitches in that first fold on the bias binding, it's going to turn out really nice for you. Again, I made sure that I overlapped 1/4 of an inch before I backstitched. Now that we have the edge of the binding all sewn down, we're gonna flip it to the wrong side. And now what we're gonna do is flip the entire piece of binding over. Make sure that that edge is folded up that 1/4. And now what we're gonna do is pull the whole piece of binding over and pin it down. So you're not gonna have any binding on the outside of your garment. Let me put a few pins in and then flip it back over so you can see it. So you'll notice that the outside of the neckline has no binding showing. The whole entire piece of binding is on the inside. So we wanna go ahead and pin all that down, and then again, we will edge stitch on the edge of the binding to sew it down, and we will have a nice clean finished neckline. So this is called a bias facing. And now we're gonna pin this all the way around. I love a nice biased face neckline. It's so beautiful and clean looking. And if you use a contrasting color, the inside of your garment gets a little pop. Notice how nice the binding is laying around the edge of the neckline. That's because this little strip of fabric is cut on the bias. Again, if you try just cutting a strip of fabric on the straight grain, this would not work the same way. It actually would not work at all. Okay, so this is the inside of our garment here with the binding, and then if we flip it over, the outside of our garment just has a nice clean edge. So when we're sewing, we're gonna sew on the very edge of the binding, making sure it stays down. Let's go sew up our binding and finish our neckline and try it on. Okay, so make sure you're lining up the edge of your binding with that inner edge of the A foot so we're getting nice and close to the edge when we stitch. Don't forget to backstitch. Take out your pins when you get to them. And work your way all the way around the neckline. Backstitch and cut. The outside of our garment has the stitch on it, but there's no binding. So we've got this top stitch on the outside. When we flip it over to the inside, you can see our nice bias binding that is on the inside. Again, this is called a bias facing. Okay, so if we try it on, it's gonna look something like this. So remember, this is a bias bound neckline, and this is a bias facing on a neckline. Thanks for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions on how to make a bias bound neckline or a bias bound neck facing, Let me know and leave it down below in the comments. Also, I'd love to know what you thought about this video, so please leave it down below and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. Also, give this video a thumbs up, give it some applause, and make sure you follow Zoe Anastasia on Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, TikTok, and all those other social media sites. So let's stay connected and keep inspiring each other through our projects and creativity. If you're not already a subscriber to Zoe Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when all my new videos come out. Also, I would love to see your projects, so make sure you share them with me. Tag me on Instagram or Facebook, or just shoot them over to me in an email. I would love to share them with everybody else and keep everybody else inspired and creative. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.